The realm. Do you know what the realm is? It's the 1,000 blades of Aegon's enemies. A story we agreed to tell each other over and over till we forget that it's a lie.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back for another Game of Thrones video. Alright my friends, in this video, I will finally show you what happens in my next episode of Game of Thrones Season 9. As you all know, I have been writing my own season of the show. Now, I do want to say I am sorry it has been so long since the release of my last episode. I should have made this video a lot sooner. I want to thank all of you who are still invested in my version of the following events. Hopefully you will enjoy these last episodes as this season reaches the end. Now, for those of you who don't remember, let me go over some of the things that happened in the last episode, otherwise this one might not make any sense. The very last thing we saw in that episode was the resurrection of Dany's dragon Rhaegal. After holding one of their sacred ceremonies on the beach of Dragonstone, the children of the forest were able to bring him back by using their ancient magic. Once the dragon was lifted from the ocean, it vanished into the night sky, as it was heading for a destination unknown. As of right now, almost every main character who is still alive are on their way to King's Landing. Arya, Gendry, and about 500 of his bannermen are heading there now. Arya is hoping she can find out why Bran sent the assassin after her. Daenerys, Drogon, Grey Worm, Kinvara, Makaro, and all of the slave soldiers of the Fiery Hand are heading for King's Landing as well. Jon Snow, Helen Reed, and Giantsbane will also be there soon. They left Winterfell in the last episode. They also have several hundred Northmen with them. All of these characters will arrive in King's Landing in this episode. It won't be long before they all find out exactly what's happening with their king, Brandon Stark. If only they knew what was happening in the capital of Westeros at this very moment. When we were last in King's Landing, Bran Stark was moments away from executing several members of his small council. Everyone was gathered outside, watching, as Lord Tyrion Lannister was on his knees in front of the executioner's block, waiting for his beheading. If you remember, Brienne was given an option. Bran Stark said she could either execute Tyrion Lannister, or her and Sir Podrick would hang. He said the sword or the noose. Now, Brienne said she could not make that choice. However, once the nooses were around their necks, and the floor fell out from under their feet, Brienne shouted a single word. The word she said was sword. That means she agreed to execute Lord Tyrion so she could save herself and Sir Podrick. Now let me show you what happens next, in Season 9, Episode 8. This episode is named, Burn Them All. Shall we begin? In the very first scene of this episode, we are back in King's Landing. There is still a massive crowd gathered around outside of the Red Keep. All of their eyes are focused on what is happening up on the center stage in front of them. Samwell, Davos, as well as everyone else who is standing around them are watching in silence, as Brienne and Sir Podrick are cut down from their nooses. As soon as their bodies hit the ground, they immediately start gasping for breath. Lord Tyrion Lannister's head rises from the executioner's block. He looks behind him, shocked by what he heard. Brienne is slowly getting back on her feet, but it's not easy while her hands are still bound behind her back. When she looks over at Tyrion, all he can do is shake his head no. There is sadness in her eyes again, but only for a moment. Now she looks away as one of the members of the Kingsguard begins walking over her way. He's holding a small blade in his right hand. He grabs Brienne by the shoulder, then moves her so he can free the rope that's wrapped around her hands. He does the same thing for Sir Podrick, who is now standing up on his feet as well. Sam looks over at Davos, unsure of what will happen next. "Lady Brienne," says a voice from the other end of the stage. Everyone looks over at Bran Stark, who has a member of his new Kingsguard standing on his right and left side. Laying across his lap is Oathkeeper, Brienne's Valyrian steel sword. "Lady Brienne," says Bran again. As he lifts up her sword in the air, he says, "I believe you were asking for this. The sword is yours, and you and Sir Podrick will be free to go. But first, you must lay Lord Tyrion's head at my feet. Remember, the sword or the noose." "I will not ask you again," says Bran. The member of the Kingsguard walks back across the stage. He is then handed Brienne's Valyrian steel sword. Sam and Davos watch as the man walks back across the stage again, now holding the sword out in front of him. Every one of the onlookers in the crowd are silent as a crypt. The Kingsguardman stops when he is standing before Brienne. He hands her the sword, then steps off to the side. Brienne grabs a firm grip around Oathkeeper's handle with both hands. She looks over at Bran, as well as the other Kingsguardmen who are standing at his right and left side. Then she looks over at Sir Podrick, who is ever so slightly shaking his head no. Brienne extends her arms out in front of her. The reflection of the sun bounces off her sword. She begins resting the blade on the back of Lord Tyrion's neck as she takes in another deep breath. The edge of Oathkeeper is so sharp, you can already see a drop of blood on the back of the neck where the blade is resting. Brienne slowly raises the sword high above her head. Lord Tyrion shuts his eyes as his body begins to involuntarily shake. As soon as the blade begins to fall from the sky, Brienne does a sidestep, then swings the sword around with her arms now fully extended. In one swift motion, Oathkeeper slices all the way through the neck of the Kingsguardman standing at her side. His head goes bouncing off the stage into the crowd. A thick rope of blood shoots out of his neck 6 feet into the sky. The crowd of onlookers below erupt into absolute chaos. The Kingsguardman who is standing at Bran's left side begins rushing forward. As soon as Brienne sees him, their blades come crashing into each other. The sound of steel slamming against steel can be heard echoing throughout the city square. Sir Podrick runs over and grabs the sword from the headless body laying in front of him. He immediately starts cutting the restraints around Davos and Sam's hands. When Davos is set free, he grabs the small blade from the headless Kingsguardman. Then he helps Lord Tyrion with the rope around his hands and feet. Brienne's sword smashes against the other member of the Kingsguard's sword again, only now it knocks it free from his hand. Before his sword even hits the ground, Brienne drives her own right through his stomach and out of his back. As soon as she yanks it back out, his lifeless body collapses. Brienne then drops down on one knee, hoping to find her breath. Everything happens so fast, it's almost as if everyone on stage is in a daze. Davos, Sam, and the others all look at each other stunned by what just happened. Half of the crowd standing down below begins to leave now that the show is over. The other half finally goes silent, as they wonder what will happen now. Suddenly, Brienne stands back up on her feet. She then begins walking back and forth across the stage, looking at everything and everyone around her. After several moments of this, Brienne finally says, "Where is Bran?" There was an anger in her voice that none of them heard from her before. They all begin desperately looking around the stage. Somehow, Bran must have escaped after the fighting broke out. Brienne looks at them in disbelief. This scene ends after she says, "He couldn't have gone far." In the following scene, we go right outside of the city. We can see King's Landing in the distance, maybe only a few miles away. It looks as if there are hundreds of ravens circling above the castle. Arya Stark suddenly stops her horse. Gendry does the same, before he says, "Why are we stopping here? We're almost there." Arya looks up into the sky above them, searching to see if any ravens are following. When she doesn't see any, Arya says, "I don't want us marching 500 men right up to the gates. We don't want everyone in that city thinking we're here for a fight. We gotta find my brother Bran before any of his guards find us first. We also need to find a boat. I know of a way we can get into the castle undetected." Gendry smiles, then says, "I'm sure you do." "Go find me the commander," says Arya. "I will need to speak to him before we leave." Gendry whistles, then motions for one of the men who is standing at the front of the line. Arya and Gendry hop down from their horses as the commander steps forward. Arya says, "We will need you and all of your men to wait here. Gendry and I will head into the city first. If we need your assistance, we will give a signal." "We will be ready when you are," says the commander. We follow Arya and Gendry as they walk down the hill behind them before they begin walking along the bank of the Blackwater Rush. The sun in the sky is slowly starting to hide behind the horizon. There are several men fishing on the other side of the shore, but neither of them notice Arya or Gendry. They end up walking 1.5 miles before they find a dock that has a boat. Without hesitation, Arya grabs her dagger, slices the rope securing it to the dock, then jumps in. Gendry shoves the boat away from the dock before he jumps in himself. The fast-flowing water dumps them right out onto the Blackwater Bay within minutes. They stay right along the shoreline until they're directly under the Red Keep. Once they're under the castle, Gendry hops out and brings the small boat up onto the beach. After Arya gets out, her eyes shoot back out across the Blackwater Bay. Arya is shocked when she suddenly notices something unexpected. There is a massive black dragon filling the sky up above, and right below it on the bay is what looks like 100 ships heading their way. Gendry's eyes are now filled with fear. He says, "We must hurry, my lady. Those are the banners of the Lord of Light. They have somehow taken over Daenerys' dragon." "I'm not so sure of that," Arya says. "If that's Drogon, then I'm afraid Daenerys is with them. You were there when the Hound killed Beric Dondarrion. The Lord of Light brought him back right before our very own eyes. If they somehow have Daenerys' body, she's alive." Gendry knows he has seen a resurrection before, but he's still shocked at the thought of Daenerys coming back on her dragon. Look again, says Arya. Gendry's eyes follow hers back out onto the Blackwater Bay. They can now see the banners of House Targaryen flapping above some of those ships. When Gendry looks back at her in disbelief, Arya shouts, "Let's go." The scene ends after Arya and Gendry vanish into the sewage drain. In the following scene, we are suddenly on the other side of the city, in front of its main gate. Well, I should say this is where the main gate was. It's no longer there since Drogon blew it wide open with his dragon flame. There are about a dozen masons finishing some stonework before it gets dark, but there's still a big hole where the city's main gate used to be. There is also several men of the City Watch standing there on guard. One of the men from the City Watch begins walking forward after he sees a large force heading his way. Right in front of him are Jon Snow, Hallan Reed, and Tormund Giantsbane, who have arrived at King's Landing as well. Almost every main character who is still alive are now here. Now, unlike Arya and Gendry, Jon has brought all of his men with him to the city. There are several hundred soldiers standing behind Jon and the others. This is exactly where Jon stood moments before the Battle of King's Landing begun. As the man from the City Watch walks forward, Hallan Reed stands beside Jon, then whispers, "She's here." Jon looks over at him before he says, "Who is here, my lord?" Hallan Reed diverts his eyes to the sky as he looks off into the distance. "See for yourself," says Hallan Reed. Jon's eyes look out across the city. At first, all he sees is the Red Keep on the other side of King's Landing, but as he looks up further above the castle, he suddenly notices black wings in the sky. Jon now has a dreadful look on his face after he recognizes Drogon flying in front of the moon in the distance. He remembers what he did to the men who murdered him. He wonders if Dany will want to do the same thing. Jon suddenly finds himself reaching for his sword, but he shifts his focus once the man from the City Watch stops in front of him. "What is the meaning of this?" says the Gold Cloak. "Why are there hundreds of soldiers standing outside of our gates?" "I need to see the king right away," says Jon. "I don't think so," says the man of the City Watch. "You can't just show up here like this and expect to see the king whenever you want. I would suggest that you and your men go back." But the man is interrupted by Tormund Giantsbane before he can ever finish his sentence. This is when Tormund says, "We did not march all of this way to ask you for permission. We are entering this city one way or another. Now you can either step aside and let us in, or I will go through you myself." "We're not here to fight with you," says Hallan Reed. "We're here because the king is in danger. We want to help him." Then, Hallan Reed lifts a finger into the sky and says, "Besides, I would be more worried about that than I would be with us." When the man of the City Watch looks over his shoulder, his mouth hangs open in shock once he sees a dragon circling above the Red Keep. He says nothing as Jon and all of his men begin walking forward into the city. The scene ends as we watch them head right for the king's castle. In the following scene, we are now in the dungeons of the Red Keep. Arya Stark and Gendry are making their way into the castle's dark underbelly. When they walk out of one of the black hallways, Arya notices the dragon skulls up ahead. "We're almost there," says Arya. "Follow me." They walk over to where there are a long flight of stairs leading up to the main level of the castle. They slowly and silently walk up each step. Arya grabs her dagger as they emerge from the shadows, then out onto the main floor. After a few moments, she looks back over her shoulder at Gendry in disbelief. "There's no guards," says Arya. "That doesn't make any sense. It almost feels as if the castle is empty." They stay against the wall as they walk on the other side of the hall. Now they enter the hall that was once the home of the Iron Throne. There are still a few ravens walking along the floor. Gendry motions in the direction where the Iron Throne once sat. There are some bones scattered across the floor as well. What in the seven hells happened here, Gendry wondered. This castle has become a graveyard. They exit the Great Hall. Now they walk across the small council room, then over the map of Westeros that's on the floor. There is a full moon up in the sky above them, but it vanishes after Drogon flaps his massive black wings in front of it. "Let's go," says Arya. As they begin ascending the stairs, they suddenly hear the sound of a voice. They can see Bran's door is slightly open before they even reach it. Arya immediately swings open his door with her right hand, while she holds her Valyrian steel dagger in her left hand. Once they are inside the room, they are unexpectedly greeted by Sir Davos, Samwell, Brienne, Sir Podrick, and Lord Tyrion. They're all stunned when they see Arya walking through that door. "Lady Arya," says Brienne, "why are you back in King's Landing? I thought you were leaving Westeros for good." "So did I," says Arya. "That was until an assassin was waiting for me in the cabin on my ship. I wasn't sure if I should believe the man or not, but the unknown man said that Bran was the one who hired him to kill me." I'm here to find out what's wrong with my brother. I guess he wants me dead. You're not the only one, says Lord Tyrion. He wants all of us dead. He would have been successful if it wasn't for Brienne saving our lives. Where is Bran at now, asks Gendry. We don't know, says Davos. One minute he was here, then the next, he was gone. We need to find him right away, says Arya. They're suddenly interrupted by a thunderous sound that only could have come from a dragon. The sound of dread can be heard in Lord Tyrion's voice when he says, "What the hell was that?" You know what that sound was, says Arya. You were around the dragons longer than any of us. It looks like Daenerys is back from the dead. She has 100 ships right outside of the city walls. Everyone looks a bit shaken up by the revelation. No one says a word for a few moments. Finally, Davos says, well, the fact that we're not all burning alive right now might be a good sign that she's not here for a fight. If that really is Drogon above us, we would be dead already, if that's what she wanted. Davos's words ease some of the nervousness in the room, but Arya doesn't look so sure about that. Arya grabs the burning torch out of Gendry's hand before walking out onto the balcony of the king's chambers. She begins waving it back and forth in the air, giving the signal to the men waiting outside of the city. When Arya walks back inside, she says, well, we're about to find out exactly what Daenerys wants. If it is a fight that she wants, we will give her one. Gendry, let's move. Arya and Gendry exit the room before heading back down the stairs. Unsure of what to do next, Brienne, Sam, Davos, Tyrion, and Sir Podrick follow right behind them. All of them walk across the painted map of Westeros, then through the small council room, before heading down the hallway that leads into the Great Hall, where the Iron Throne was once located. After they enter the Great Hall, they suddenly stop when they hear the sound of loud footsteps walking their way. Arya and Brienne reach for their weapon. One of the ravens lets out a loud shriek before it starts circling above their heads near the ceiling. Finally, there are shadows that emerge from the darkness on the other side of the Great Hall. Arya, Gendry, Brienne, Sir Podrick, Davos, Sam, and Lord Tyrion watch as they slowly walk their way. Daenerys Targaryen has officially arrived. Walking in front of her is Grey Worm, as well as several of his Unsullied men. They already have their weapons in hand. On Dany's right and left side are Kinvara and Makaro. Walking behind them are about a dozen slave soldiers of the Fiery Hand. Lord Tyrion Lannister has a fearful look in his eyes. He almost looks as if he'd just seen a ghost. The silence is interrupted by a thunderous scream, as Drogon lands on the roof of the Red Keep. The ceiling begins shaking as the dragon walks over to where there is still a large opening in the castle wall. The moonlight is glimmering off of his shiny black scales. His dark red eyes never leave Daenerys, as he watches over his mother in the Great Hall. When they reach the center of the room, Grey Worm and his Unsullied men step aside as Kinvara and Makaro step forward. In a loud booming voice that echoes throughout the hall, Makaro says, "My friends, we are here on this night on behalf of our Lord of Light." He then looks over at Arya when he says, "Unfortunately, a darkness rises again. It has fallen over Westeros already, yet it threatens our very existence as it sweeps over the entire realm. The Great Other has your brother as we speak. We must act fast. Will you stand beside us as we bring the light back into all of our lives again?" Davos, Brienne, Sam, and Tyrion all look at each other in disbelief. "I don't understand," says Arya. "I killed the Night King. I watched as his army fell right before my very own eyes. What are you saying?" Makaro's dark, shining eyes study everyone in the Great Hall as he says, "The Night King was simply an instrument of the Great Other, just as we are simply an instrument of the Lord of Light. Why do you think your brother tried to have you killed?" There was a wariness in Arya's voice as she asked him, "How did you know about that?" Makaro smiles before he says, "I have seen this and much more in R'hllor's sacred flames." He then looks back at Daenerys and says, "The Lord of Light has shown me Daenerys Stormborn's worth. That's why we stand beside her now. Every night in my fires, I have glimpsed the glory that awaits her." "Is that right?" Arya says angrily. "Did this Lord of Light show you what Daenerys did to this city? I saw that with my own eyes as well. I was down there in those city streets, watching as her and her dragon burned innocent women and children. Is that this glory that you speak of? Now, if that's not darkness falling over Westeros, then I don't know what is." "The Lady Arya is right," whispered a voice from the shadows. "There was a darkness within Daenerys and even her dragon as she burned the city to the ground. It was the same darkness that lives within your brother Brandon Stark now." "Who said that?" asked Arya. "Do you know where my brother is?" A moment goes by before the man behind the voice steps out of the shadows. "My name is Howland Reed, my lady. I know where your brother is, and I know what is wrong with him. I'm afraid the Great Other has him now, and all of us must leave soon, if we want to live. Some of the anger leaves Arya's eyes as she says, "You were friends with my father." "I was, my lady," says Howland Reed. Arya looks at Kinvara and Makaro, then back at Howland Reed before she says, "Both of you speak of this great other, yet I don't know what that is. Who are they? Where are they? And what do they want with Bran?" "Well, it's just as he said," says Howland Reed. "Your brother is simply their instrument, no different than the Night King was before. They created the Night King after all, and they were living inside of his mind the same way that they are inside of Bran's mind now. There is an island not far from here known as the Isle of Faces. Some of you may know it as the God's Eye. On this sacred isle live some of the wisest and eldest living members of the Children of the Forest. They have been living there since before the first man ever stepped foot on Westerosi soil. They are extremely dangerous, and their veins have been filled with hatred for thousands of years. They want the same thing Daenerys wanted. They want what they believe is rightfully theirs. They want back all of the land that man stole from them, and they will stop at nothing unless every last one of us are dead." Lord Tyrion, who has been standing behind everyone else, finally steps forward. A hint of anger flashes across Dany's face after she sees him. "So they have been inside of Bran's mind, making him kill all of us," says Tyrion. "I'm afraid so," says Howland Reed. After a moment of silence, Lord Tyrion whispers, "Why do you think I came all this way?" This immediately gets the attention of Arya, Sam, Davos, Gendry, and Brienne. They all remember hearing Bran say that right before he was named king. "He knew," says Tyrion. "He knew exactly what would happen. After I suggested we name Bran as our new king, he said, 'Why do you think I came all this way?' It's as if everything happened exactly the way he wanted. He knew we would defeat the army of the dead." After a sadness fills his eyes, Lord Tyrion looks at Dany, then says, "He knew Daenerys would burn King's Landing." He then sits down after suddenly feeling a bit dizzy. Finally, Dany says, "Did they orchestrate everything?" while she is looking at Lord Howland Reed. "Yes, they did," said a familiar voice from the shadows. As Jon Snow emerges from the darkness, he says, "Everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. That was the very last thing Bran said to me right before he shipped me off to spend the rest of my life at Castle Black." When Drogon sees Jon again, he lets out a thunderous scream so loud it feels as if it shook the very foundation of the castle. The ravens that were circling around the Great Hall immediately scatter into the wind. It looks like the wind has been knocked right out of Daenerys after she sees Jon for herself. Grey Worm and the Unsullied ready their weapons immediately. Arya and Brienne do the same. When Kinvara and Makaro notice this, they step in front of Jon, hoping to avoid any bloodshed just yet. "Your Grace," Jon says nervously, "I'm sorry for what happened. I did not know then what I'm beginning to understand now. Lord Tyrion is right. Bran, or I should say the Children of the Forest, knew exactly what would happen. They wanted all of us to destroy each other. I finally understand why Bran said I was exactly where I was supposed to be. He knew you would burn down King's Landing. He must have seen it in one of his visions, and he knew that I would execute you for that. Now I see why he so easily sent me to the wall. He needed me out of the way, but only after I did what he knew I would do." Jon then looks at Arya and says, "That's why he sent an assassin after you. He saw you kill the Night King. He knew you would be one of his biggest threats. He had to get rid of you the same way he was getting rid of all of us. Once they had the Iron Throne, they no longer needed any of us. Don't you see that now?"
Bran.
I'm not really.
You died in that cave.
You're a man.
Almost.
I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me.
You were exactly where you were supposed to be.
If we choose you, will you wear the crown?
Why do you think I came all this way?
To go through all of that and make your way home again only to find such chaos in the world. I can only imagine.
Chaos is a ladder.
The Great Hall is suddenly as silent as a crypt. Everyone is looking around at each other in disbelief, but also realizing what has been happening all along. Daenerys begins walking forward, out from behind all of her guards. Grey Worm goes to stop her, but she lays her hand on his before shaking her head no. She walks out across the Great Hall until she is standing in front of Howland Reed and Jon Snow. Dany looks in Jon's eyes for several moments as she thinks about everything that has been said. She looks over at Howland Reed, then says, "I guess now there is only one thing I want to know. How can we defeat them once and for all?" The scene ends right after Howland Reed says, "Well, we will defeat them the same way they were using you and your dragon to kill everyone in this city. We will burn them all." In the final scene of this episode, we are back on the shore of the Isle of Faces. This scene begins by us getting a good look at the full moon that is sitting above the God's Eye. There are hundreds of ravens circling in the sky above all of the island's sacred weirwoods. We watch as shadows shift around in the woods. No different than any other night, the Green Men are getting ready to stand their silent watch as they guard the Isle of Faces. Thousands of little green men begin emerging from within the woods. As always, all of them are holding weapons of their own. Their weapons are made up of different dragonglass. Some of them are black, green, and even red. The faces on the weirwoods behind them are somehow more frightening than they were before. They have hatred in their blood-red eyes. They all have been sitting here, silently watching and waiting for thousands of years. It makes you wonder how many horrific sacrifices they have seen over those several millennia. As soon as all of the green men are standing in a circle around the whole island, something else begins shifting in the shadows. The sound of branches breaking and the leaves crunching under the footsteps is very reminiscent of the sound of bones breaking. The little green men are not the only ones watching and waiting on this evening. Suddenly, what looks like 100,000 glowing blue eyes begin emerging from the darkness within the forest. This massive army is made up of nothing but White Walkers, who are still riding on the back of their giant elks. Only these White Walkers look slightly different than the ones we've seen before. Now, as frightening as they look, they also have a bit of elegance to them, sort of like a haunting beauty. All of them begin surrounding the sacred island as well. They're ready for whatever is heading their way. Now we begin to move to the center of the island, where the largest weirwood in Westeros is located. Once again, we see the grove of 7 weirwoods that are all facing inward at each other. Right in the center of them is a massive weirwood, with a very large open mouth on its face. There are bones and skulls scattered all around the weirwoods on the floor of the forest. This is where the episode will end. The final thing we see is what's inside this massive weirwood. The episode will fade to black after we get a glimpse of Brandon Stark sitting in this mouth of madness. Like the three-eyed raven before, Brandon Stark is entangled by the roots of the weirwood. It looks like the children of the forest have made this his new home. A home that he will never be able to leave again.